Hello, everyone, and welcome to Always Choose Orange, the show that provides actionable ways to develop and maintain a thriving creative process. I'm your host, Alex Acanero, and today's guest is David Benjamin Blower, a prolific musician, a writer of theological books, a podcaster, and an activist from Birmingham in the United Kingdom. His writing, like his music, is characterized by its political and religious vision and by its apocalyptic imagination. His new book, The Messianic Commons, Images of the Messiah After Modernity, is out now through SCM Press, and his most recent album, Kindness is Solid Stone, Violence is a Heavy Loan to Pay, is available on all platforms.
Always choose orange.
All right, so the place that I want to start is where where your ideas come from. So if you're just, living your life and walking around, at what point or in what form do do you know you have a song on your hands, I guess? Does it come to you usually melodically? Do you have an idea that you're ruminating on? Is there something that you're seeking to explore? Is it different every time?
Oh, that's a great question. That's a difficult question. I don't think it's always the same thing. Um I think probably more than anything else, I it um tends to be two things. One is that one is that I'm wanting to explore. So some puzzle is bothering me. Perhaps it's a social or a political or a theological thing. All these things are very interconnected for me. So I guess I'm always thinking about the stories we live in and the sort of the shared experiences we have as human creatures. Um, so I'm often thinking about stuff. I'm very bookish. Um, I'm very prayerful. These sort of places um, are sources of curiosity and feeling for me. But then the other thing that I think is important is that I'm probably emotionally processing something, on a very personal level. If a subject has captured me, if I'm thinking about what it means to be a human creature among other creatures on the planet, or if I'm thinking about how do you live with people that you consider dangerous, um, or things like this. I'm probably thinking about it a lot because it's sitting on some wound or some place of feeling or experience that's very, very personal to me. So I think some combination of those kinds of things.
So, I guess using the most recent album as maybe a jumping off point for like a specific look at that, where, at what point, like, do you start on the macro level in the sense of, okay, you have this theme that you're exploring, like you said, like something that you're either working through, you're processing, you're praying about. Do you start on the, okay, I have this large scale idea and I'm gonna find or create songs to fit inside of this larger idea? Or do you start on the micro level and you have an idea for a song and then all of a sudden you build it out from there and realize, oh, I have a larger body of work here. I'm super curious because I feel like there's so many different
Mm.
ways of approaching the large scale work.
Yeah, again, it's not always the same. I think the things I've done that have been most energizing to me, um, and that have probably created the most energizing connection between me and others, and will tend to be um, uh, how to say, like I'll make an album in the same way that, or I feel more like I'm writing a play.
Okay.
So it will often be that there's a big story I want to tell, or there's something I want to explore by sort of almost making a story of it. Um, yeah, a long time ago, as a musical performer, I stopped, um, doing the thing where you make a set list when you perform live,
Okay.
and I started doing a thing where I would just play one album through
Oh,
in exactly the same order as it is on a record. And it's because I was kind of making stories that had a plot arc, and there's a sort of a sense of the flow in that respect. But having said that, um, I've also made uh, things that are connected. I also sort of have to make money to live. Um, so for example, I made some albums of like hymns for nomads albums or what have you. And those are not stories at all. They don't have a plot arc. They're not a play. I've never performed them all the way through. I don't think I've hardly ever performed them. But it's because I've been making these songs um, as I went for a podcast. That was just a job. It's just a job. Um, and then you'd have a bunch of them, so you'd collect them together um, and they'd go out like that. I think the last thing I made, the last album, is "Kindness is Solid Stone, Violence is a Heavy Load to Pay." And bits and pieces of those songs were, yeah, some of them were um, things I'd written for podcasting jobs and that kind of thing. So it was half collected together. Um, but then it kind of came together had a coherence and a theme at the end. So yeah, there's these two ends of the scale of the creative process for me. Sometimes I'm trying to create some coherent drama. Other times I'm collecting together things that I've been doing because that's my job from time to time.
When you say like you created them for like a podcasting job and stuff, and I know you've been involved in I think a number of podcasts and stuff over the years. What does that look like? Was it you were writing these songs to perform like on a podcast, or kind of? I would love to hear more about what kind of you mean by that.
Oh, most of the stuff I made um, related to podcasting was with a podcast called Nomad Podcast. It was a sort of progressive Christian podcast. What still is progressive Christian podcast for want of other labels. And one of my jobs was to make like for patrons, behind the paywall things. So I'd make one of these each month, and most months I'd create a song for, on a subject. So they were quite musical things. But it was a bit like, you know, uh, it's a bit like being a cartoonist for a newspaper or something. It's a job. You have to create something by this deadline, and you put it out, and the personal connection to what you're making is a little bit different there. You're kind of doing what you have to do to some extent, which isn't a bad way to make things. Yeah, it's just another thing.
Do you prefer? Not that you have to have a preference, I guess, but I'm just kind of curious. Do you prefer the large scale drama narrative collections of work? Like if you had the money problem was solved and we take that off the table, is that how you
Hmm.
sort of prefer and tend to create, or is there sort of also this freedom in I'm only worrying about one song at a time and kind of seeing just what comes up?
Or I definitely prefer the big vision, really, creating
Okay.
something that tells a big story. Uh, yeah, the other bit's a job. And I'm always in two minds about whether I prefer just to be you know, do some kind of job that doesn't sort of ask creative questions of me, so I can keep them separate. I don't know. Yeah, no, I definitely prefer artistic freedom, I guess.
When you're forming one of those large scale pieces, so I think like the one that, at least from the outside, has the most sort of tight and obvious narrative is that Book of Jonah project you did, what, 2016, 2017 back then. Um, what, what questions are you asking yourself, or what are you looking at when you're forming like a narrative through music? Because that's something that's always resonated with me about some of my favorite albums is I love the idea of sequencing the thing and sort of it feeling like it's taking you on a journey. And now I know with the Book of Jonah you have the biblical text to work off of, so that gives you sort of that framework. But I'm very curious as to what how you sort of formed that musically, or like how that project came about specifically, I guess. Like what was
Mm.
sort of the seeds of it? Like what caused you to jump into it? And then how did you sort of build that out to feel so cohesive and so narratively tight?
Yeah, that was a really interesting project to make. I took a lot of time over it. I actually made it twice as well. Um, it began, I think I'd read the novel Moby Dick.
Oh, yeah.
And I had a gig on, and I was really out of sorts. I wasn't in the mood for it. So my friend Mike, who plays the accordion for me, sometimes said, "Oh, let's just play sea shanties." So we played this gig um, where we just played sea shanties. We don't know how to play sea shanties. It was a very peculiar thing to do. Um, and one part of it, he was playing the squeeze box, um, and I read the prayer that Jonah sort of prays. This very bitter, deathly um, kind of discourse from inside the whales, inside the belly of the great fish. From the King James Bible, so it's all Shakespearean, all these and thous, all the old language. And it was very cathartic. It was very healing for me, being as I was in a very uh, under kind of a dark cloud that day. Um, so yeah, I partly fell into it from there, and then the other thing that threw me into it was seeing on the news that this was back in 2014, I think, um, when ISIS were at large in Syria and Iraq. There was a news item that where this mosque in the city of Mosul was destroyed. It was blown up by ISIS because it was the wrong kind of Islam as they saw it. Um, but this mosque was like the had the tomb of tradition holds that it had the tomb of Jonah in it, and it had these relics like a whale's tooth and things like that. Jonah being a prophet in Islam as well. Um, so it kind of threw me into a very Jonah-ish question about enemies and the people who are just so terrifying and awful that you would never want to go and reason with them or what have you. Um, so I kind of got lent into that story in a new way. I think when I was writing music for it, I was just seeing things in the text that I'd never heard talked about. When people, I've sort of grown up in a sort of Christian sort of world. My upbringing's quite Christian, so I'd hear the story of Jonah. I think everyone hears the story of Jonah, whether you're religious or not, don't you? But and the story was always that Jonah was just like a badly behaved person because he didn't do what he was told, and he was supposed to go like a good kind of Victorian missionary and preach repentance to Nineveh. But I was seeing the story completely differently. I was seeing that Jonah didn't want to go to Nineveh for completely reasonable reasons, because it was the Neo-Assyrian Empire was very, very violent, um, and very, very terrifying. Kind of absolute horror stories. If one reads historians' run-throughs of what their kind of militaristic programs look like. Um, so I was seeing somebody who had very good reason to not want to do that. So I wanted to, I guess I was telling a story expressing um, the very painful the very painful um, challenge to go and humanize the worst kinds of people, the people that you think of as absolutely the enemy and absolutely beyond reason or compassion or humanity or anything like that. Yeah, so it's interesting to me to create songs telling those kinds of stories, I guess.
When you were putting it together, did you write any songs or try any pieces of the story that didn't end up being on the project? Or did it sort of come to you formed in the sense that you knew? I mean, obviously there's certain beats of that story that like have to be told for it to form that coherent narrative. But was there other aspects of it that you tried? Did you end up writing like more
Hmm.
songs or song fragments that didn't make it in? Or I guess I'm curious about the process too of like, did it come together sort of linear, or were you sort of picking emotionally resonant moments of the story and then sort of building it all over in a different order and then assembling it?
Ah, good questions. I don't think that I wrote any songs that didn't make it onto the finished thing. And I think generally speaking, it's quite unusual for me to write a song that gets discarded.
Okay.
It does happen occasionally, but not very often. I suppose my process doesn't tend to involve making lots of things and then picking the best.
Mm.
It tends to be because I'm trying to tell a story, you can't, like, I can't really miss a bit out of the story. So if part of the story is not working, then it'll tend to be that I'm sort of messing around with it until it does work, rather than getting rid of it. So yeah, like I think every song I tried to write ended up on there. Um, the only question is how well they work. The uh, On the other hand, I will say that I made the album twice because I recorded it. It was coming towards a finished state, and then I turned on my computer and it died. So I actually lost the whole thing the first time around. Um, and Yeah, the screen went blank. I thought, is it gone? Um, and then I think I heard the voice of God say that it sounded like all my other albums anyway. Um, so there we go. I kind of uh, took a walk and let it be for a while, and then remade it. I think a lot better, and I got some other people involved that I wouldn't have that I didn't have involved the first time around, and made it a lot better.
Wow. Yeah, what an experience. Yeah, you worked so hard on it. It was completely done too, and then you lost it or close to completely done.
Yeah, it was close to. I mean, I think I was probably going towards mastering, all the songs and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Dang,
Yeah.
that is brutal. And then and so it ended up sounding completely different. Like was it the same songs or were some of the songs even completely different?
No, the songs are all the same. I didn't
Okay.
add songs or lose songs or change songs really. I recorded them better because I got a new computer and some less sort of old and rusty stuff. Um, and then I got several other people to voice things on there that made it a lot better.
Okay.
Um, so yeah, I suppose it's interesting that I remade it, pretty much as it was. So my script tends to end up getting pretty well set, really.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. That makes a lot of sense. When you're working on an individual song, is it starting um as sort of a combination of the lyric and the words? Like, do you have like do these ideas come to you in melodic form, or are you sometimes writing the words down independent of music and then finding ways to turn them into music? I'm super curious about that whole piece of it, like how you kind of work through a song as it starts to form.
My gosh, I don't know. It's like trying to remember at what point you fell asleep. You
Yeah,
just wake
right.
up in the morning and you don't know how you got there, do you? Um, I don't think um, I don't think there's always one way that it happens for me. I will say that I'm not the person who, hears a brilliant thing in his head and then sort of unfolds it and forms it into something, and it just started off with that curious, walking around and humming something like Winnie the Pooh. Um, I mean, that occasionally happens. Oh, I mean, uh, but I just find that an annoyance and uh,
Yeah.
carry on with my day. It really things tend to start with. in my case, because I'm exploring something going on inside myself. So creating um, words and music out of it tend to be sort of an intentional process from that point. Um, on Sometimes, if I'm working on things that have a folk ethic to them or a folk feeling aesthetically, I'll probably spend more time walking around, singing words to myself, just because I think if a song makes sense sung a cappella,
Mm.
um, then for me those tend to be the strongest kinds of songs, you know. Um, so if it's that kind of thing, it's I'm often wandering around looking for it. Um, but then other things I make are really different. Other things are like layering up things, you know, sounds and much more in um, a home studio environment, experimenting with things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then when you're sort of taking lyrics or ideas from, or being more directly inspired, I guess. So I'm thinking of the William Blake project that you did, or when you were working with the Psalms and stuff. Um, what is that process like, I guess? Is that any different than what you were kind of just outlining when you have sort of this text that's inspiring you, I would imagine, in some way or speaking to you, and you're having to take this thing that wasn't necessarily like they're musical in the sense that they're poetry, but we don't know, what, obviously chord progression or anything like would go well behind that stuff. What is that process like?
Mm. Yeah, the Psalms one was interesting because it was, I mean, I was writing those songs again for a podcast, you know, to go behind a podcast paywall.
Okay.
So they were these things I was making every month. Uh, and it just helps to have a theme, doesn't it? So you don't have
Yeah.
to arrive and say, oh, well, what do I do now? Um, and yeah, and then I sort of worked quite hard to create a coherent um, piece out of, you know, to make a one album that's one thing out of it. Um, and I don't know how well I succeeded. I guess that sort of describes some kind of mixture between when you're creating songs for a job and pulling them together, and then on the other hand, trying to create a greater sense of linear story and coherence in the ebb and flow of what you pull together. The William Blake one, I can't even remember what happened.
Yeah.
I, like I made it so quickly. I think um I can't even remember where I began.
Yeah.
I must have like I th at the time I was sort of finding old folk songs and just singing them, and often like finding old folk songs I'd find, you know, in old dusty charity shop books I'd find lyrics but not music or anything. So I would just be making up music to these old lyrics and singing these old songs. So there's a feeling of resonating with the past and with you know, with land in that way. So I was just kind of in the rhythm of that. I started doing that with William Blake poems, and I must have just had a need to hang everything and just make something for 2 weeks. I think it all turned around in that kind of period of time.
Wow. Okay.
But there we go. I think I was probably just trying to um, uh, manage some weather.
Yeah, sure. Just a mad dash of creativity. I love those periods though, where some stuff is drawn out and painstaking, and then sometimes it's just comes out of you extremely fast. That's
Right, yeah, just like shaking something out,
yeah,
or shaking yourself out and making something in the process.
yeah. Um, I'm also super interested in sort of the interplay between your music and sort of your own exploration or textual commentary on what you've just made, or and maybe it happens in a different order. I guess I don't want to assume that that's how it happens. That's what it looks like from the outside. So I'm thinking specifically of the newest album. Kindness is a solid stone, violence is a heavy loan. Um, no debts, no masters. So that's one of my favorite tracks on the album. Really powerful, really resonant, very sort of mantra-like lyrics, repeated kind of over and over again. And then on your Substack, you have that essay series of kind of exploring all those different ideas, sort of those four refusals and what they mean, to you and throughout history and in modern society and all that stuff. I'm super curious as to, I guess, which one of those things came first. Were you exploring those ideas philosophically on paper? Or did the song already exist and you were sort of ruminating on that? Or I guess, yeah, like what was sort of the impetus for that sort of deep dive into it? Because it really helps like listen to the song different. So I'd heard the song and then read the essay series and then went back and listened to the song, some more. And it's cool to listen to it after going on that journey with you.
Yeah. Oh, I suppose it's a mark of uh like a restless need to paint a picture. I'm not really in love with any medium. Um, I don't make music because I love music. I make music because I love life.
Hmm.
Like music um is a way of celebrating or feeling out or lamenting, the experience of being alive. So it's I mean that song, No Debts, No Masters, No Law, No Caesars. Um, Love fulfills it all. Love will be all in all. That's the only lyrics to the song. You could say, that's you can write it in two lines. Um, so it's this chant that goes around. Um, uh, but there we go. I'm not like it's uh, it means something to me to be able to sing that, to
Yeah.
be able to hum that. Um, but I'm interested in gathering around people's fires, and I'm interested in gathering people around a fire. Um, I want to sort of find every way I can to explore what I'm looking for. I'm always looking for something if I write a song or if I write an essay. So um, yeah, there's many examples of that really where I've um, um, a s music has produced a book or a map or other pieces of work because I'm not interested in the things in themselves, the song or the book, or I'm interested in what they're reaching for.
Hmm.
Yeah, yes, I think there's a restless need to keep, find every way you can to search for the thing you're looking for, really.
I love that. Do you feel like you ever find it, or does the need sort of shift towards another topic? So like for I guess sitting on that same example we were just looking at, after making that song and after exploring it, I'm not saying that you like solved right all of the philosophical issues that you were examining, right? So I'm not saying that because I would imagine that's impossible. But did you feel any sort of um like the completion of a journey, or like does it I'm not sure exactly how to articulate what I'm saying, but like did it feel like you sort of met that need, I guess, at the end of that process? Like do you ever sort of after writing the book or making an album or something feel like, okay, yeah, I explored that as much as I want to right now, I'm going to explore something
Hmm.
else?
Um, no, I think something a phrase that that comes back to me fairly continually is you can't drink the river.
Yeah.
You can only stand in it. So I think there's uh it's not that I'm never satisfied. Um sometimes I get to the place of being satisfied that I'll never be satisfied.
Yes.
Sometimes it becomes enough just to have dwelt with something as long as I could. I think, yeah, I I have. It's very helpful for me to remember that I'm very small. I'm just a creature among many creatures, and to experience things as richly and share them as much as I can is the most wonderful gift for me. Um, but it's not for me to solve anything, I think.
Yeah, right, right. I love that river metaphor. That's really good. I have not heard that before, but that is some very sound perspective and advice. Um, I'm curious also about your relationship between sort of input and output. So when you're working on a project and making things, how much are you looking at other things? I know you were mentioning, being, a big reader and thinking in that sense, but also, you play music and stuff. So I imagine you listen to music. What is sort of your relationship, yeah, between input and output? Like do you ever go out and try to find inspiration, or is it something that kind of happens naturally?
I don't think I ever go looking for inspiration. I if I didn't feel inspired by something, I just wouldn't feel any need to create anything. I wouldn't go looking for a reason to do it myself. Um, but then when I'm transfixed by something, then I'm, going everywhere looking for, I'm sort of in a feverish mapping process, looking for everything, how does it touch this? How does it touch that? Like, um, who do I now want to speak to? Who can tell me about this? Like, how does this experience knock onto this person's experience and that person's experience? So, yeah, when I'm interested in something, I'm following all the threads. Um, and if I'm not in that place, it's kind of a relief.
Yeah. Yeah.
I I'll it's nice to read it's nice to read some Tolkien just because it's nice to read some Tolkien, and not be trying to weave it into something I'm making or something like that. Um, yeah, that's how it is for me.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. I feel like I'm kind of the same way where, yeah, you like I'll get fixated on a certain thing and it's fun and it's enjoyable, but feverish is a very good word where you're just sort of like gonna read this interview and talk to this person and read these 5 books and listen to this podcast or whatever. And then yeah, at the end it's kind of like, okay, cool. I can sort of like go outside and look at trees and sit down and kind of have fun.
I mean, you're a novelist, I believe. So, I mean, I've never written a novel, but having to string together a world and create that kind of, coherent map of something, that's a lot, isn't it?
It totally is, yeah. Especially I'm kind of realizing about the project that I'm currently working on, which involves a lot of that because it's sort of this fantasy world is, yeah, I think it's a lot more challenging, I guess, than I thought it was gonna be. And so I'm realizing that basing things and sort of rooting them in the real world is probably where I'll head in the future because you're right, it is a lot. And having to keep it all straight and invent it all and sort of figure out what you're gonna, take from the real world and what you're gonna invent. I
Mm,
don't know, some people
mm.
are probably naturally really good at that, but I find that challenging.
Yeah, I bet. Yeah, I've every now and then I've wandered into that world and I've sort of quite quickly walked out backwards.
Yeah. Yeah. Is there any I guess art forms sort of that you explore maybe not as publicly as other things? So I know that, music, you have your books, you've done, a lot of podcasting and spoken communication, and I've seen some of the diagrams that you've, created based on concepts that you've been exploring. Is there like other things that you do kind of less publicly, or are those sort of your main expressions that you find that are interesting and come naturally to you?
I'm often making visual art. Um, yeah, and not very much of it finds its way out there. It's one. It feels quite different to me because I suppose when I write or make music, I feel a certain amount of like if I use if I use the tool, I kind of get the result I thought I was going to get, but that's not the way it is with visual art at all. Um, so so I really like making visual art, particularly like print type art, like lino cut stuff and letterpress stuff. Um, but yeah, I'm not like it doesn't really find its way out there. I guess it's just I don't know how much I'm. I guess maybe I just make it because I like doing it rather than because I need to put it out there. But yeah, no, it always feels like my second language, you know. Not
Yeah.
not uh not the thing I feel like so at ease in.
Okay.
But I can't stop messing around with it anyway.
Yeah. Did you make the album cover for Kindness to Solid Stone? Like is that like a block print or a lino cut?
Yeah, it's a lino cut. I enjoy making making type. I mean, I love type. I love lettering and that kind of thing. I have an old letterpress machine, like 100-year-old thing.
Oh, cool.
Um, but then this is where you carve it. You know, that text was carved out by hand, and I like the gnarly kind of look of that. I'm really interested in like the 1600s,
Yeah.
and you've got the kind of early days of printing and all these kind of revolutionary political pamphlets, and they look really wonky, and words are spelt wrong because they didn't have enough of that letter in the drawer, so they just use this one, and I love all that stuff.
What inspired the name of the album? Like Kindness is Solid Stone, Violence is a Heavy Load. Um, how did that was the song made first and then you said that kind of encapsulates what I'm going for on here? But I love that. I love that title and it's like something that you can kind of meditate on if you choose to and keep getting something out of. But yeah, I'm curious as to how that sort of took shape.
I think a lot of the songs were floating around, um, and then uh, the thing um, that sort of grabbed hold of me as it grabbed hold of everybody else was uh, after um, October the 7th, the year before last, um, when there was uh, Hamas um, made an attack and a lot of Israelis died. Um, and then there was the kind of um, an uneasy few weeks when you knew that um, you knew what was going to happen next and that it was going to be awful. Um, so I was in massive grief, um, as as everybody was, about what happened and about what was about to happen. And so many thousands of people in Gaza have died since then. Um, so yeah, that's that that title is just um, I don't feel good about moralizing, or it seems ridiculous to, in the face of genocidal violence um, in some way. So it's not me trying to tell anybody anything. It's me. There we go. Grieving. I think, and knowing that, um, yeah, there's no good outcomes to uh, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, right. And I think that's what I love about the title and the album is that yeah, it doesn't do that moralizing and it has a blend of lament and hope sort of baked into every song. Like you can listen to a lot of the songs and feel sort of like grief heavy, kind of process, the lamenting, but at the same time, there's a lot of hope in it too. And sort of that idea of um was that album like were you writing sort of your newest book like on the concept of the Messiah and what that means sort of socially and stuff? Was that being created around the same time? Because it feels like a lot of those ideas sort of underpin the music in the sense of there's sort of like where the hope comes from is sort of this sort of thousands of year old hope of like someday this is gonna be put right and it's gonna be different. Were those things talking to each other?
Oh yeah, very much. And I think that dialectic between grief um, and hope are always. I don't know if I've ever made anything that wasn't really about that. Um, but yeah, the book, The Messianic Commons, was written. I mean, I wasn't trying to write a book really. They were different pieces of writing that were speaking to each other that I sort of um, pulled together because there was interest from a publisher kind of later on. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, that for me is like the deepest thing in the experience of being human. The griefs, um, the violence, the losses that occur and are occurring around us are um, more than I can uh, ever begin to sort of process or feel my way through or understand or accept or come to terms with. Um, and yet it's still worth being here. Um, I think hope is absurd. I think it's an absurdity. I think it's to wrap your to to see it as absurd, but to walk towards it anyway. I think um, that's the peculiar pact I find myself living in.
Yeah, it's sometimes it feels like the only way to deal with it. At least for me, yeah. When you especially like seeing like you were mentioning earlier, sort of like horrific and hard to be with global events that maybe on an individual level we can feel powerless about. I think like yeah, it's the only thing to hold on to is this absurdity of like yeah, it might get better.
Yeah, yeah, and it's sort of it's meaningful to me on the the global scale, but also just on the personal scale. Um, uh, it's really unusual for a person to live their life without encountering a grief that's really too much to, that's another river you can't drink. You just have to be with it, and um, it's always going to be moving past you, kind of thing. Um, so yeah, whether it's on the micro or the macro, that's a very ordinary part of human experience, I guess.
What specifically, just for people who might, hear us here talking about the newest book, the Messianic Commons, what do you mind describing briefly like what you're exploring in it, just to give people an idea on what it is?
Yeah, although I find it very, very difficult to do. I sort of made a book that I've found really, really, still find really difficult to describe. Um, I'm really interested in the messianic idea. Um, as I say, I'm like my uh, tradition would be Christian. Um, I also read a lot of kind of but I'm interested in religious spaces of all kind. The dialogue between Christianity and Judaism has always been a thing of interest to me. Um, and one of the kind of the points of difference as it's sometimes described, is that in Christianity, the Messiah's already been nothing much really changed. Salvation became sort of a very inward, personal kind of thing. In Judaism, the Messianic idea is very much this public historical event that comes and changes everything.
Mm.
And I think I'm kind of more transfixed by that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in my I guess I do a lot of theological work, and my reading of the New Testament, I think that's more of interest to those writers as well. I think the sort of the development of Christianity is into something very inward and private is something I don't really resonate with, and something that doesn't really resonate with what I find in those formative texts. So um, I'm fascinated by the messianic idea, even as just a thought experiment that anybody could do, whether they were religious or not, where you ask yourself, well, what would the world be like if I
Mm-hmm.
woke up tomorrow and the messianic age had dawned and everything was just as it should be? And if I imagine that, I have, all kinds of ideas about um, how it would feel and how it would be and what would be there and what wouldn't be there and what wouldn't be happening anymore. And it tells me a lot about what my values are, what I think. It tells me a lot about what I'm against and what I think is wrong with the world. So it's like as a starting point um, to orient yourself. That's something. But then there's this process of humility that needs to happen. There's a writer called Theodore Adorno who talks about this, where at that point I need to realize, well, what I've come to the conclusion of is that the world's a very broken place, and that I'm part of the world, and that I'm probably quite a broken person. And my perspective of the world made right is probably also quite broken. So my vision is probably not quite right. So then I have this doubt. Um, but then lastly, um, says Theodore Adorno, you have to walk towards your best vision because it's the best you got anyway. So you got to walk towards it with some kind of doubt in your pocket. I find that thought experiment fascinating, beautiful, and a really rich kind of um, dialogue space between myself and another. What does another person, vision? What's their vision of the world made whole and healed and right? How's it different? The differences are the exciting points of dialogue. Um, that's where we discover and learn things that are outside our own experience. Where do we share values? Oh, well, that's where partnership and convergence is possible, and so on. So it's about these kinds of things. It's a very social, political, economic kind of exploration of a religious idea.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Yeah, that's cool. I've not had the chance to read it yet, but I plan on it, and I really want to. That sounds fascinating. I think another aspect of the thought experiment that I find fascinating is that, like, by nature um of just the whole idea is that, like, the Messiah is not us. So then what do we do? And how do we play a role in that? And kind of that
Mm.
we're waiting for somebody else to do something, but then there's like our role of how can we take care of things too, and what role do we play into ushering that in? That's fascinating.
Yeah, yeah. That's a huge question in the book. I sort of spend all sorts of time feeling around that. I find that very, very interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. No, that's awesome. A few more questions here. One of them being, I saw so I listen to a lot of your music on Spotify, and I saw that there's like a playlist on there of sort of like folk spirituals, and kind of like a really cool collection of songs and stuff on there. Um, I'm curious about, do you sort of sonically go a certain direction on your projects on purpose, or is that kind of just happen as the result of what you're listening to, what you're feeling, what you're exploring? Because it does feel like over the course of your projects that there's a lot of commonalities and a lot of through lines, but that there's different sort of things being explored in different sonic palettes.
Mm. Yeah, it's, interesting question. At the moment, I'm finishing an album that's really different. It's much more of a racket. Um, partly because I sort of felt like actually that my sonic palette had sort of um I had my favorite colors,
Yeah.
um, and I'd been using them for a long time. Um, I mean, to some degree, I making music, I'm exploring an idea in sound as much as I am in words. So creating, you know, uh, it has to sound like sorrow. It has to sound like absurdity or hope. It has to sound like violence. Um, yeah, I think that's part of the hard work, and probably if I take a lot of time over something, that's the thing I'm always um, spending the most time on is looking. It needs to sound. It needs to sound. It needs to feel um, like like the story it's telling. But there we go. I think it's also the thing where it's easiest to fall into a set of colors that feel familiar and um, that you've been using for a while. So I kind of feel like uh, I think I've made enough kind of um, sad, slow, folky things
Sure.
for a good while. I get somebody reviewed what was it, the Psalms record, and said and said that I sounded drunk the whole time, which was and it was a really warm review. It was a really five star review. So they didn't mean it in a bad way, but it's really true. And I think it's because I would be a very slow, slurring sort of drunk. It's that kind of thing. Um, yeah. So there you go. I think when you're creating something, that there are parts of yourself it's hard to see, and you have to stand back a bit and um,
Yeah.
introduce something that you don't really know how it works in order to interrupt and disrupt yourself.
When you're working on this new project then and consciously doing that, how, how do you even do that, I guess? Because I find that when I'm making stuff, right, like there's these colors, there's these patterns, these grooves that I'm in, and to get out of them, like for me, what works for me is like using some sort of prompt or something that forces me to think differently and not use these same patterns of creating. What do you find works for you in terms of as you're venturing into this new sonic space and sort of moving outside of sort of the style that you just described? Like what has been working for you, I guess, in terms of not sort of falling back on the same patterns?
Yeah, I think the answer for me is to be really attentive, to listen really carefully to what's going on in inside myself. I think it if I sort of look back and think that the palette feels tired. Um, I think it's because of being in a conversation space um, that that really had become interested in talking about the same sort of things over a set of time. And we all speak the language of the world around us.
Yeah.
So I think my sort of beginning to feel that something felt like it was going around in circles somewhat was was partly to do with coming to the terms with that I was sort of drawn to sensibilities, questions that were not being explored or asked in the kind of um, environments and situations and discussions and working environments that I was in. So I think it was about being attentive to that reality and listening very carefully to the voice in myself that wasn't able to be heard in that kind of scenario. Um, and I think once I can hear that voice, or give space to that feeling, I think finding the right sound for it's just like, you know, it's just finding the hat that goes with the shoes. It's it finds its own sound if I listen to it carefully enough.
Okay.
Um, Something like that.
Yeah. That actually reminded me of like I have a specific question about a very specific song. So, and I saw this on a comment on your Substack. Someone was asking you about the sound at the end of No Debts, No Masters. The sort of like jingling sound. And I heard you kind of, or I saw that your comment where you were talking about like your keys being in your pocket. I'm wondering if you could kind of tell that story about how that outro for that song ended up forming the way it did because it's really cool and it's like like it feels like it fits very well, but it sounds like based on the comment that I saw that it was kind of accidental. So I'm just curious as to yeah, if you don't mind telling that story.
Mm. Yeah, I can't remember exactly how it happened. So I think I was recording like vocals or what have you for this song, and I don't know if I like knocked my keys or dropped them or something. Um, yeah, but there we go. It was a spontaneous. I guess I thought it sounded good or something like that, and picked them up and went with it. And so it's quite, it's probably the last minute of the song is just I owe it to my ring of keys that just uh, sounded great and wanted to be part of it. I mean, I don't even know what it means. So sometimes you do just follow the sound. I really believe in leaving the process open to chaos
Yeah.
because it's always the accident that makes the sonic palette of the song special. Um, so many complaints about how many coughs there are in, my early albums because I just wouldn't cut them out. They're all, part of it. But yeah, I sort of it doesn't feel all right to have total control over what's going on. It's the thing that was accidental, that was not intended, that doesn't come from me, that makes something alive, I think.
I love that idea. I love that. Yeah, just sort of the like the openness to lead to allow the chaos because sometimes it can. I mean, especially in that case, even like it adds so much depth and color and character to a song that I guess if we're not careful, especially with the way technology is, like it's so easy to make something so rigidly controlled, and I think there's something so pure and invigorating about the rough humanness of it. And so I love that. And I also love the idea of like leaving the sound in there and not knowing what it means. And obviously everyone's gonna take it however they take it. But like how I take the sound is like it kind of reminds me of Ain't No Grave by Johnny Cash. How there's like the stomp
Mm,
sort of clap and there's like these almost like chain sounds happening. And so like as I, heard, the outro of your song, it kind of reminded me of that and then sort of this idea of like being free from, it reminded me of chains and then sort of being free for like chains falling off because you're free from the debts, the masters, the Caesars, the law. So like obviously that I'm not saying you sat down and like you said it was an accident and you didn't sit down and think of those things, but I love that like art is so subjective to where we can make all sorts of associations with this happy
mm.
accident that came up just because, you dropped your keys.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's something it makes something trustworthy and true to life. Um uh I feel the opposite way about something where everything was planned, that just doesn't sound like a real or living thing, or reflective of the complexity of living in the world.
Yeah. Two more questions, sort of some inspiration slash like what like your hopes are question. So the first of the two is and this one kind of always trips people up, but it's always a really fun question and it's what are like if you had to pick, now I'm not asking for your favorite or anything, but what are like three albums that you recommend, anyone who's watching or listening to this listens to from start to finish because as a body of work they've either meant something to you or something that you find like that is important musically or anything like that? Like, could be from anyone, any genre, anything. I'm just curious as to like, yeah, whether it's from an inspiration standpoint or just something that you really enjoy.
Mm. Um, yeah, that's not difficult to do at all. One is the first one, without thinking twice, is Music for 18 Musicians by Steve Reich. So Steve Reich's minimalist composer, American composer. Um, I'm not sure when it was made, like the 70s, maybe. I'm not sure. Late 20th century piece of music. It's instrumental. It's minimalism. It's kind of pulses and loops, but all performed live. On sort of pianos and oboes and xylophones and voices. Um, and it's just an hour of absolute hypnosis and my favorite piece of music of the 20th century.
Wow.
There's one. Number two would be Wise by Joanna Newsom. Y apostrophe S. I assume that's how it's said. Um, so it's an album by Joanna Newsom, the harpist um, and singer. It's just five very, very long, very epic songs. Um, and the words, the sounds, and the performance is absolutely beautiful. The scoring is amazing, and the words themselves. If I could just sit down and read them, I would be very, very happy. That it's the absolutely stunning um, poetry. Um, and the third one uh, is Bitter Tears by the album Bitter Tears by Johnny Cash, um, which is an album he made in the late 60s that just tells stories about Native American experience. Um, I love Johnny Cash. I love everything Johnny Cash does. Well, nearly everything. I get the impression even Johnny Cash didn't like everything Johnny Cash did.
Yeah.
Um, but that album is devastating and stunning and moves me to my bones.
The question I'd love to end on is what do you hope people feel, think, experience when they come into contact with, the things that you've made? Is there sort of something that and not necessarily, I'm not saying like in a moralizing way or anything like that, but just is there sort of something that you hope to leave people with through the things that you make?
That's a really difficult question. Hmm. Um, hmm. I don't know. I hope that um, whatever anybody finds in anything that I've done, that I'm worried about saying it because I'm worried it'll be taken the wrong way. The thing I find myself wanting to say is I hope that people become more like themselves, um, more deeply in touch with themselves, more who they are, um, in some way. I'm nervous of saying it because I'm really not fond of the kind of self-actualization, self-realization kind of rhetoric that fills the world. Um, I believe that life is absolutely relational and that nothing means anything apart from relationship. Um, I understand myself to be a creature in relationship to all other creatures and in relationship to a creator. Um, uh, I guess I just think I'm troubled by the sufferings of the world insofar as we're living out lies that we tell ourselves or lies that we're obliged to live in by the powers that be. I'm quite unambiguously an anarchist, um, And I think for me, there is a prayerful space. Um, for me, it is a prayerful space. It's to do with communication um, with God as I see it, with awe um, beyond myself. Um, but that space for me is a space where I encounter what's truthfully going on. Um, and visions from that space enable me to maybe do things differently or do things better um, or make some small act of liberation. So that's what I mean when I say that. But yeah, I hope that that people are able to find their way into some space like that that is beautiful and compelling and gives them reason to be here.
That's yeah, that's a beautiful thing. David, I appreciate you taking the time to come, talk with me and share about your creative process and all the things that you've made. And yeah, means a lot to have you on here. Appreciate it. It was an honor.
It's lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much for having me.
Always choose orange.